My name is Sophia, and I've been married to Mark for 7 years. On paper, our life looks perfect. Respectable careers, a cozy home in the suburbs, weekend dinner parties with friends. But beneath the surface, there's a hollow space between us that keeps widening, no matter how tightly I try to hold on. Mark used to be different, attentive, warm, spontaneous. But somewhere between his late-night conference calls and endless business trips, the man I married faded into someone I barely recognize. Our conversations are clipped, our affection mechanical, and our bedroom has become a cold, unvisited place. I told myself it was normal, that long-term marriages went through phases. But this didn't feel like a phase. It felt permanent. I craved air, space, a pulse of something that wasn't muted by routine or buried beneath Mark's unread emails. So when a solo jungle tour ad popped up while I was browsing travel blogs one evening, something inside me stirred. A guided nature retreat, hiking, wildlife, kayaking, far from phone signals and deadlines. It wasn't something I'd normally do alone, but maybe that was the point. Mark barely looked up when I mentioned it. "Sounds good," he muttered, eyes fixed on his laptop screen. "You probably need a break." A break. That word echoed louder than he realized. 2 weeks later, I found myself stepping off a rugged safari van into the heart of a dense rainforest. The scent of damp earth and moss was intoxicating. Towering trees loomed above, their canopies tangled in sunlight and shadows. Around me, the small group of tourists chattered excitedly. But my attention was drawn elsewhere. He stood a few feet away, securing equipment to his backpack. Diego, our guide. Tall, lean, sun-bronzed skin. His movements were fluid, confident, almost feline. A soft breeze tousled his dark hair, and when he looked up, our eyes met for the briefest moment. There was something in his gaze, quiet intensity, a kind of primal stillness that unsettled me in a way I couldn't name. "Welcome to the wild," he said, his voice low and textured, with a faint accent that curled around each word. "Here, the jungle teaches you more about yourself than any city ever could." I smiled politely and turned away, telling myself not to be foolish. It was just admiration, like appreciating a work of art. Harmless. The first few days passed in a rhythm of hikes, river crossings, and late-night campfires. Diego was everything a guide should be: knowledgeable, calm under pressure, attentive to everyone's safety. But it was the way he paid attention to me that unsettled something deep inside. "You're observant," he remarked one afternoon, after I identified a rare orchid clinging to a tree trunk. "Most people just walk by without really seeing." His compliment felt different, not flirtatious, not overt, but layered. Noticing me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I laughed it off, but my pulse betrayed me. I was hyper-aware of his nearness, of how his hand occasionally brushed mine when he handed me gear, how his eyes lingered for just a beat longer than necessary when we spoke. And yet I said nothing. I did nothing. Because I was a married woman on a nature retreat. That was all. One evening, after a particularly steep climb, I slipped slightly on a wet rock. Diego reached out instantly, his hand catching mine. The contact was firm, grounding, and far too intimate for a moment that was supposed to be purely practical. "You okay?" he asked, holding my gaze. "Yes," I said quickly, pulling my hand back. "Thanks." But that touch stayed with me long after the moment passed. That night, as I lay inside my tent, the rainforest alive with chirps and rustling leaves, I couldn't stop replaying that split second in my mind. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting attraction, a byproduct of being away from the monotony of home. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Something quietly dangerous. I didn't come here looking for anything more than solitude. I didn't expect to feel anything beyond peace and adventure. But something in this jungle was awakening parts of me I thought had long since gone numb. And Diego, he was starting to feel like more than just a guide. He felt like a spark I hadn't realized I'd been craving all along. The jungle had a rhythm, untamed, unpredictable, and strangely seductive. Each day blurred into the next, yet every hour with Diego felt distinct, like a page turning toward something I wasn't prepared to read. I tried to distract myself with the beauty around me, lush green corridors, the haunting cry of howler monkeys in the distance, the iridescent flutter of hummingbirds. But no matter how I tried to refocus, Diego's presence lingered like the humid air, thick, unavoidable, intimate. The group dynamic shifted subtly. People paired off for short hikes or took quiet moments by the river. I noticed that Diego seemed to hover nearby whenever I was alone, always under the guise of being helpful. But his gaze betrayed more than professional courtesy. One afternoon, dark clouds rolled in without warning. Rain fell in thick sheets, forcing the group to scatter toward nearby shelters. I ended up under a narrow rock ledge, just wide enough for two. A few minutes later, Diego ducked beneath it, shaking rain from his hair, water dripping down his jawline. "Looks like we're trapped," he said, smiling. My heart raced, not from the storm, but from the sudden proximity. His arm brushed mine. Our shoulders pressed together in the cramped space, skin humming with heat even as the rain chilled the air. "Do you miss him?" he asked quietly. It took me a second to process the question. "Your husband," he clarified. "You haven't mentioned him much." I hesitated. "I guess I miss who he used to be. Or maybe I just miss being seen." Diego didn't respond immediately. His eyes held mine for a long moment, unreadable. "You're seen," he said finally, "even if it's not by him." I should have turned away. I should have changed the subject, laughed it off, drawn a line in the sand. But I didn't. I stayed in that charged silence, allowing it to wrap around us like a second skin. "Why are you really here, Sophia?" he asked. I swallowed. Because I needed to remember who I was before I became someone's wife, someone's afterthought. Diego nodded slowly, then reached out, brushing a damp strand of hair from my cheek. The touch was featherlight, yet it sparked something seismic inside me. "You're not an afterthought," he whispered. "You're fire. You just forgot how to burn." His words slipped under my skin, igniting something buried beneath years of neglect and numbness. And then, without hesitation, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't urgent or forceful. It was slow, searching, almost reverent. My body froze, torn between instinct and guilt. But my lips responded before my conscience could intervene. The kiss deepened, and for a moment, I forgot everything. My wedding band, Mark's cold voice, the boundaries I'd sworn not to cross. When I finally pulled back, breathless, the weight of reality crashed down. "I'm married," I said, voice trembling. His eyes didn't flinch. "I know. This can't happen." He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply nodded, but there was something in his expression, something that said this wasn't over. We walked back in silence once the rain eased. The others were already gathered around the campfire, unaware of the line I'd just crossed. That night, I lay awake in my tent, heart pounding beneath my sleeping bag. My lips still tingled from his kiss. Guilt gnawed at me, but beneath it pulsed a deeper hunger, one I hadn't felt in years. A hunger for connection, for warmth, for being desired. I told myself it had been a mistake, a slip, nothing more. But deep down I knew better. Something had shifted. Something I couldn't undo. I avoided Diego the next morning, hoping distance would silence whatever had begun between us. But when our eyes met across the breakfast table, the air between us said everything our mouths didn't. Later, during a kayaking session, he offered to help me adjust my gear. His hands brushed my waist briefly, another electric touch, disguised as routine. "You're strong," he said softly as I paddled away. "Stronger than you think." I didn't reply, but my heart betrayed me, fluttering wildly, already anticipating the next moment we'd be alone. And I knew, with terrifying clarity, that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The forest no longer felt like just a destination. It had become a cocoon, dense, green, and pulsing with something unspoken between us. Each rustle of leaves, each brush of wind, seemed to carry a secret only Diego and I could understand. I kept telling myself it was a momentary lapse, an impulsive kiss born from isolation, heat, and unmet needs. But the truth settled heavier each day. I hadn't pulled away because I didn't want it. I'd pulled away because I did. The days continued, but they were different now. Every interaction with Diego carried an undercurrent, an invisible thread tethering us tighter with each glance, each shared silence. The group noticed nothing, but I saw the shift in his gaze, the slight pause in his steps when I walked behind him, the subtle way his fingers brushed mine when passing gear. I started to crave those fleeting touches, tiny, stolen moments that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Guilt and desire warred inside me constantly. I'd wake up dreading the shame and go to bed longing for the next encounter. It was a paradox I couldn't escape. One evening, after a long trek through a narrow ravine, Diego asked me to stay behind under the pretense of checking equipment. The others moved ahead, their laughter fading into the canopy. "You've been quiet," he said, eyes studying mine. "I've been trying to remember who I'm supposed to be," I replied, half joking, half confessing. His expression softened. "And who do you feel like now?" I didn't answer. Instead, I stepped closer, drawn to him like the tide to the shore, inevitable and reckless. This time, I kissed him. There was no hesitation in him, only a deep, patient hunger. The kiss grew urgent, our bodies pressed against the moss-covered rock behind us. His hands explored my waist, my back, my neck, as if trying to memorize every inch of me. It wasn't just passion. It was release. A flood of everything I'd buried beneath years of silence and polite nods across a dinner table. When it ended, we stood in silence, chests heaving, the jungle pulsing around us. "This isn't just lust, is it?" I asked, voice barely audible. "No," he said simply. "It's something else." That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the canvas ceiling of my tent, trying to silence the emotions swirling inside me. It wasn't just the thrill of the forbidden, it was the ache of being wanted. Not just touched, but seen. Not just heard, but felt. And yet, the guilt still lingered. Mark's face flashed in my mind. Not his touch, not his voice, but his absence. The man I'd once loved now existed only in memory, and I hated that I wasn't sure if I missed him or just missed the version of myself I used to be when we were happy. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of stolen glances and quiet tension. I didn't seek out Diego, but I didn't avoid him either. We'd find each other in quiet pockets of the jungle, by the river bend, beneath the fig trees, near the edge of a canyon trail. Each encounter grew more intimate. Deeper kisses, lingering caresses, whispered conversations about nothing and everything. He never pushed, never demanded more. He just was present, patient, unspoken in his understanding of how fragile my heart had become. On the final night of the tour, the group gathered around a fire. The air buzzed with laughter and farewell toasts, but my heart was heavy. Diego sat across from me, silent, contemplative. He didn't try to speak. He didn't need to. Later, after the others drifted into sleep, I stepped away from camp. Diego followed a few minutes later. "I leave tomorrow," I said quietly. "I know," he replied. We stood under the stars, the jungle humming around us like a living heartbeat. No words, no promises, just a final, slow kiss that tasted of goodbye. That night, we made love beneath the canopy of trees, tender, quiet, reverent. It was not lust. It was grief wrapped in warmth. It was goodbye disguised as comfort. When I left the next morning, he didn't come to the van. He didn't need to. But in my pocket, I found a small pendant, hand-carved from wood, shaped like a leaf. No note, just a symbol. A memory pressed between the lines of who I was and who I had become. And even now, days later, as I unpack my suitcase beside a husband who doesn't look up from his phone, I can still feel the jungle clinging to my skin.